Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal, and I started several videos responding to this Dark Horse podcast clip about a Florida law basically giving doctors conscience protections for both abortion and mutilating children through trans procedures, whether it's chemical mutilation or surgical mutilation. And it was 6 minutes and 48 seconds into it until I saw that Brent gets it. So I'm backing up a little bit. I haven't listened to everything Brent has to say, and I haven't listened yet to Heather's response, but Brent gets it. Okay, so let's listen.
But I do want to point to the genuinely difficult underlying stuff here. Okay, when you first, I did not know that the abortion limitations and the
not allowing medical intervention for minors who declare themselves trans.
Right, were housed in the same bill. On the other hand, when I hear that, I instantly get why that would have to be the case. It's, I thought maybe it's sneaky political stuff, but in some sense, what DeSantis appears to be trying to do is to carve out a mechanism where doctors cannot be forced into really diabolical medical interventions, right? If society is going to say...
Brent gets it. And Brent is pro-choice. But let's hear him out.
Well, we have to support these children in their transition, and that means that you have to, A, agree that such a thing is reasonable, and B, provide the medications that set the children up, and C, get them into the surgical setting where this all happens. If you're a doctor who thinks you're talking about mutilating children on the basis that they learned something at school that made them think for, some period during their teenage years that they might be in the wrong body, and I don't want any part of participating because I swore an oath that I wouldn't do that sort of thing, that doctor has to have the right to say no, right?
And this is something that the trans movement, and I'm not talking about ordinary trans people like Blair White. Blair White is not pushing for let's trans every kid who's ever confused about their sex. So, the trans movement wants to push for this. And Karlin Borisenko said it's because they want everybody to be neuter. They want to abolish the family. And the way you abolish the family is you render people unable to have children. And what transing kids is, even just the puberty blockers alone are enough to render the child sterile.
And so I guess my point is, as soon as you recognize that doctor has to have the right to say no, in some sense you've recognized that doctors have the right to say no, and obviously you and I are in a very different place than DeSantis and others on that side of the fence with respect to the right to an abortion early in pregnancy. But I don't see a meaningful difference between a doctor's right to object to maiming children according to this, trans belief structure that has so cynically been foisted upon us, and the right to say no to participating in that process.
Framed as...
Notice he says that process. He doesn't say, look, if it's wrong to force a doctor to mutilate a child, it's wrong to force a doctor to kill one. Heather and Brent kind of dance around what an abortion actually is.
You are an expert in a domain for which you went to school for a very long time. It is within your purview to decide whether or not you will do some procedures. And, I guess presumably doctors have always had the right to say, actually, I don't prescribe X drug. Because I actually know that drug is not what they're claiming, and I don't care. You come to my office asking for that drug, you're going to have to find someone else. I'm sorry. I won't do it, and here's why, and I hope you won't either.
Until we got to COVID, and then doctors are not allowed to prescribe ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine because Saint Anthony says it is forbidden.
So, and I hope you won't find someone else to do it, because I really don't think it's a good choice. Similar with surgeries. Presumably, I hope, there are doctors saying, actually...
So Heather is kind of backing off of the fact that we're not just... that forcing doctors to participate in transitioning children and forcing doctors to participate in abortion is not just forcing them to do something that they don't believe is in the patient's best interest, but is forcing them to do something that they believe is a crime against humanity. A doctor may say, fine, you want this. I'm advising against it, but, I think most doctors wouldn't do it, but I don't think there's anybody trying to force doctors to perform, tonsillectomies that they think are ill-advised.
Surgery for X isn't something you should get. You've got a tear in your meniscus, in your knees meniscus, and it's not one of these bucket handle tears. It's going to be snagging on you every time you move. It's just a little tear. I overrode my doctor when I had a little tear in my meniscus, and I'm not getting surgery for that. I'm not doing it. And it was a much better choice. I wish that I had had a doctor who had been, brave enough to say, why would you get surgery in this case? So I assume that doctors have the agency, and I'm surprised that it is required that there be so I don't know. You and I are not familiar with this bill well enough, so you're framing this as like a doctor agency protector, and I don't know that we need legislation for that, so I'm not at all sure that that's what this is actually.
So Heather's not up to date on these things. Yes, Heather, there are people trying to remove conscience protection for doctors, for nurses. That if a patient walks in and she wants an abortion, you have to at least facilitate it, even if you won't perform it. And if a patient walks in wanting puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or a double mastectomy or castration, and you won't do it, you have to refer them to somebody who will. Yes, there is a big push for that, Heather. Pay attention.
Actually doing, but in terms of sort of understanding it philosophically, the two topics are linked because they are both going to have a lot of people will disagree strongly about these two topics.
Excuse me a second. Hold on. I don't know why I say I'm back after I paused, because you guys aren't aware of what I was doing, but I've lost my train of thought because I was doing something else. And we're going to start Heather and Brent up again.
Say second trimester abortions, because first trimester abortions are still...
Let me back up just a tad here.
People will disagree strongly about these two topics. Abortion, so say second trimester abortions, because first trimester abortions are still facilitated, or allowed rather, not facilitated, allowed, and not allowing interventions to minors for minors who think they are the sex they are not.
So I think you have just landed on a very important piece of this puzzle. There's a phrase that has been ringing in my ears since early in COVID, and I have not quite figured out why it's bugging me. It is standard of care. I believe doctors are less free than you think.
Yeah.
I'm interested in seeing what he says, because there's 3 standards of care that I know of. One is the reasonable patient standard of care, and that typically involves informed consent, and it is what would a reasonable patient want to know. There is a reasonable physician standard of care, which kind of looks at standard practice, the latest research, not necessarily nitpicky stuff, but if the Centers for Disease Control, puts out an alert, you should be doing this, that, or the other thing. Things like having, there might not be a law that you have to update your defibrillator every so many years, but that doctors typically, make sure their defibrillator is more recently purchased. The reasonable physician standard of care. And then there's the community standard of care, which is frankly the lowest standard of care, and that's what other doctors in your area do. And the reason the community standard of care sucks is there was a doctor named Braxton Tabb who knowingly sent a woman home with the fetal head still in her uterus, and she developed serious complications, and she sued. She went to the medical board, they slapped him down, and he brought in other Colorado abortion doctors who said, yeah, we send them home with the fetal head all the time. A reasonable physician would not send a patient home with a retained fetal head. But the community standard, which was abortion practitioners in Colorado, they said we do it all the time. And therefore, the community standard of care is you can send a patient home with a retained fetal head. So I'm wondering where Heather's going to go with this.
Because of the idea of standard of care, which I think the standard of care is going to fit on a list of objects that seem obviously positive, and it's going to be a disaster. And that list of
okay, and I think when you get with trans, I think what you're going to get is right now people are leaning toward community standard of care, which is other doctors who buy into this trans mania do this, therefore it's the standard of care, versus the reasonable physician standard of care, which is you're not going to mutilate your patient, or the reasonable patient standard of care, which is you are not going to want to embark on something that is going to hinder a major organ system, hinder your ability to reproduce, make you a patient for the rest of your life, somebody that is going to need all these hormones and is going to have all these health problems. A reasonable patient would want to know that. So a reasonable patient and reasonable physician standard of care right off the bat would protect these kids from being transed. So I think what's being relied on is the community standard of care, which is automatically going to be people who buy into all this trans the kids stuff.
objects includes things like peer review, which turns out is not the same thing as review by your peers. It is, land next to things like evidence-based medicine, which is not the same thing as following the evidence to the right medical interventions. There's a list of these euphemisms that are used to constrain the deployment of products and procedures. And the thing about standard of care is that doctors have the right to prescribe off-label, but the question is, if a drug is bad, and the conventional wisdom is that it is good, how much freedom do doctors have to opt out of it? And what we saw with COVID was that in the case of certain things, that right evaporates rather quickly.
There was no opt-out of some things, and there was no opt-in to others.
Right.
I think I was talking about this, the ivermectin and the hydroxychloroquine, and you had to use the experimental drugs. So
that is an almost perfect, you had one tool you could deploy, and what's more, you had to deploy it. And the whole thing would have unfolded very differently if that had not been the case.
Okay, so Brent gets it. Heather's kind of hovering on the side, but not too bad, Brent and Heather. Thank you.